As part of the expansion of the British Empire into India, the Anglo-Maratha Wars were a series of conflicts fought during the late 18th and early 19th century between the British East India Company and the Maratha Confederacy, the victory of which for imperial forces led to the early establishment of what would become the British Raj, that would dominate southern Asia for the next century. The Anglo-Maratha Wars began following the death of Madhavrao Peshwa of the Maratha Empire in 1772, an early modern Indian empire and later a confederation that controlled large portions of the Indian subcontinent in the 18th century. With the death of Madhavrao as Peshwa, or Prime Minister of the Maratha Empire, his brother, Narayan Rao, assumed the position, though due to various policies conducted by the new leader, which caused alienation among the various peoples that came to form the empire, this led to the assassination of Narayan Rao by his palace guards in August 1773. His uncle, Raghunath Rao, subsequently took over, but his reign was one clouded by doubt due to the birth of Narayan Rao's son, Sawai Madhavrao, 8 months after his father's death, and was thus declared legal heir to the throne by 12 Maratha chiefs, known as the Babai, who were led by Nana Padnavis. With the Babai stating their intention to remove Raghunath Rao from power, thus installing the infant Sawai as Prime Minister under the dictation of regents, Raghunath Rao sought the assistance of the British in Bombay, signing the Treaty of Surat on March 6, 1775. Under the details of the treaty, Raghunath Rao ceded the territories of Salsette and Bessain to the British, along with part of the revenues from Surat and the Baruch districts, while in return, the British promised to provide Raghunath Rao with 2,500 soldiers as a personal guard against the Babai. British troops, under the command of Colonel Keating, departed Surat on March 15, 1775, but 2 months later were thoroughly routed in an ambush led by Haripant Paddock, with casualties for Keating's force, accompanied by Raghunath Rao, being 96 killed against 150 Marathas. In the wake of the Battle of Adas, Warren Hastings, head of the Supreme Council of Bengal, noted that direct action against Poona would be detrimental, and thus the Supreme Council condemned the Treaty of Surat, dispatching Colonel Upton to Poona in order to annul the Surat Treaty and create a new treaty with the Regency. A subsequent agreement came about with the signing of the Treaty of Purandar on March 1, 1776, which, based on the terms of the accord, allowed the British to secure Salsette in return for acknowledging Sawai Madhavrao as the new Peshwa, while at the same time not recognizing the existence of the French in India. At the time, the Marathas had been trying to form a military alliance with the French, as orchestrated by 2 Frenchmen, Saint-Luban and M. Montigny, who acted as intermediaries between the French and the Poona Regency. However, following the signing of the treaty between the French and the Poona government in 1776, the Bombay government decided to invade and reinstate Raghunath Rao as leader of the Marathas, with Colonel Egerton leading an army to Khopoli before making his way through the Western Ghats at Bor Ghat and onwards towards Kala, which was reached on January 4, 1779, while under Maratha attacks. Under heavy Maratha assault, the British were forced to retreat back to Wadgaon, but were soon surrounded and backed into a desperate last stand prior to their surrender on January 16, 1779, leading to the Treaty of Wadgaon being signed, which forced the Bombay government to relinquish all territories acquired by the Bombay office of the East India Company since 1773. While reinforcements were en route from northern India, under the command of Colonel Thomas Wyndham Goddard, these arrived too late to relieve Egerton's force, though regardless, Warren Hastings refused to ratify the Treaty of Wadgaon on the grounds that the Bombay officials had no legal power to sign it, and ordered Goddard to secure British interests in the area. Goddard, with 6,000 troops, subsequently stormed Bhadra Fort and captured Ahmedabad 1 month after the defeat at Wadgaon, leading to a one-sided victory for the British, with only 2 killed, against 108 Marathas, Goddard also capturing Bassein on December 11, 1780, and Gwalior on August 4 of the same year. Skirmishes took place between the Mahaji Scindia and General Goddard in Gujarat, while Hastings continued to supply troops to the region, Goddard marching towards Poona, but was ultimately routed during the Battle of Bor Ghat in April 1781 by Parsham Maba. Meanwhile, in central India, Mahadji stationed himself at Malwa to challenge the relief column sent by Hastings, being able to put the British into retreat after sustained harassment, though the British could regain the lost ground during February 1781 during the capture of Sipri. Following a decisive British victory at the Battle of Durda on March 24, 1781, more troops arrived to assist in the campaign, which led to a panicked Mahadji to propose a new treaty between the Peshwas and the British, dubbed the Treaty of Salbai. This treaty, as signed on May 17, 1782, ended the First Anglo-Maratha War, restoring the status quo and establishing peace between the two parties for the next 20 years. Subsequent to the end of the First War, the Maratha Empire was reorganized politically into a confederacy of 5 major chiefs: the Peshwa or Prime Minister at the capital city of Pune, the Gaikwad chief of Baroda, the Scindia chief of Gwalior, the Holkar chief of Indore, and the Bonsal chief of Nagpur. However, despite peace being achieved with the British, continued internal quarrels among the chiefs, primarily as a carryover of Runganthrao's rise to power in the wake of his nephew's assassination in 1773, meant no long-term stability for the empire could be secured, with attempted diplomatic intervention by the British under Governor-General of British India, Lord Mornington, being strongly refused. Amidst this turmoil, one of the major players within the Maratha Empire was Runganthrao's son, Peshwa Baiji Rao II, who fought alongside the Scindia chief at the Battle of Pune in October 1802, whereupon they were defeated by Yashwantrao Holkar, the Holkar chief of Indore. Knowing well the support the British had provided to his father, Baji Rao fled to the protection of the colonists, eventually concluding in December of the same year the Treaty of Bassian with the British East India Company, this treaty relinquishing territory for the upholding of an auxiliary force, which allowed the British to also hold back the French influence into India. This act on the part of the Peshwa, their titular overlord, horrified the Maratha chieftains, specifically the Sahindia rulers of Gwalior and the Bonsal rulers of Nagpur and Berar, who challenged the outcomes of the treaty immensely, the Holkar rulers of Indore, hoping to broker peace with the British, arriving too late to stop the inevitable hostilities, and the Second Anglo-Maratha War officially began. In February 1803, Major General Arthur Wellesley gathered and organized his forces in Seringapatam, advancing against the Holkar forces at Pune during May of the same year alongside Baji Rao II, though the Holkars opted not to challenge the British army in pitched battle and remained evasive for the opening stages of the campaign. By August, Wellesley had outlined his primary objectives as being the destruction of the French presence on the banks of the Jumna River, to extend the frontier of the British East India Company to include Delhi and Agra, to take control of the Mughal Emperor, to construct a system of alliances with the states of Rajputana, and to annex Bundelkhand. On August 12th, Wellesley's forces captured Ahmednagar, a major supply depot for the Marathas, and a strategically important position in securing British lines of communication with Pune, the Marathas responding by way of a strike against Hyderabad. On September 23rd, an especially bloody battle took place when 4,500 British troops engaged 10,500 Maratha soldiers during the Battle of Assaye, resulting in the deaths of 1,566 British against approximately 6,000 Marathas, though despite the victory, Wellesley was criticised for the dividing of his forces that resulted in an unnecessarily high number of casualties. On October 21st, the British captured the fortress at Azagar, which implied that Scindia had lost his last possession in the Deccan region, followed a month later by Wellesley leading his men to victory against Bonsal's army of nearly 40,000 at Aragum, leading to only 360 British casualties against 5,000 Marathas. On December 15, 1803, a combined force of Wellesley and Colonel Stevenson assaulted and captured Bonsal's fortress with only 126 casualties for the British against 4,000 dead Marathas, taking the last fortified position along the infiltration route linking the Deccan to Hindustan. This led ultimately to the signing of the Treaty of Dowagon 2 days later, wherein the Raja of Berar relinquished the province of Cuttack, including Balasore and all territory west of the River Wada. This was followed by the Treaty of Surji Arjangon on December 30th, as signed by Scindia, at which point all land lying between the Jumna River and the Ganga River, as well as all forts and territories north of Jaipur, Jodhpur, and Gohud, were ceded to the British, while at the same time the colonists seized Broach and Ahmednagar, together with all territories south of the Ajanta Hills. A subsidiary treaty was subsequently signed in February 1804 by Sir John Malcolm that created an alliance with Scindia, placing a defence force of 6,000 infantry with associated cavalry and artillery on the Maratha frontier. With Scindia now subjugated, the second phase of the war continued on the northern frontier, though the Maratha leadership, which had been manned heavily by French and British officers acting essentially as mercenaries, had been stripped heavily in the months prior to the impending conflict through generous bribes by the British East India Company, robbing the Marathas of their senior military command. Under the leadership of Lord Lake, the northern campaign captured the city of Broach in Gujarat during August 1803, followed by the fort at Algar in early September, securing 281 artillery pieces that had been provided by the French, and leading to over 2,000 Maratha casualties. On September 11th, Lake led his force to victory over Frenchman Louis Barcan during the Battle of Delhi, taking tacit control of Shah Alam II, the aged Mughal emperor, this confrontation resulting in the deaths of 478 British against 4,500 Marathas. The campaign continued with great success through the autumn of 1803, with October 18th seeing the major city of Agra taken, capturing not only between 5,000 and 6,000 Marathas, but also a huge storehouse of goods and treasure, and a strategic control point in northern India. On November 1st, another very bloody battle took place at Laswari, when Lord Lake defeated a force of 17 battalions under the command of the French Colonel Doudrenek, with British casualties being just over 800, while the Marathas lost approximately 7,000, as well as 71 pieces of artillery. At the start of 1804, the British began to divide up the captured territory among their allies, with Nizam of Hyderabad being granted part of the Raja of Berar, while Peshwa Baji Rao II was assigned the fort and district of Ahmednagar, other settlements being secured through various treaties of alliance with the Rajas of Jodhpur, Jaipur, Macheri, Bundi, and the Jat ruler of Bharatapur. Back at the front line, Major General Wolseley directed the overall campaign against Holkar, with Lord Lake spearheading the assault, though while Holkar was put into retreat by superior colonial forces, the start of the monsoon season during June severely damaged major routes of communication, thus pausing the advance for several weeks. During July and August 1804, Colonel William Monson led an under-equipped force deep into Holkar territory via the Mukundra Pass, but without the support necessary to secure a decisive victory, was rapidly put into retreat, returning to Agra on August 31st, while Holkar himself put Delhi under siege during October, though a relief force dispatched by Lake broke the Maratha army. Ultimately, Holkar was defeated by Lake at Farrukhabad on November 17th, when a sizable British army was forcibly marched from Doab, a distance of 160 miles, culminating in the capture of the fortress at Dig. However, amidst the hugely successful campaign of Lord Lake during 1804, the final actions of the Second Anglo-Maratha War were a series of somewhat costly defeats when attempting to assault the fortress at Bharatpur between January and February 1805, Lake's failure to make a proper breach in the walls of the keep, meaning 100 officers and 3,100 men were needlessly sacrificed during the ultimately fruitless siege. Thus, an essential stalemate ensued until November 23, 1805, at which point the British East India Company signed a peace treaty with Scindia, the terms of which included the expiration of the defensive alliance, the restoration of Gwalior and Gohud to the Marathas, the avoidance of British treaties with the Rajput chieftain, and the return of specific portions of land. At the same time, the British East India Company passed a measure supporting the establishment of an East India College as a substitute for Fort William College in Calcutta, the outcomes of this treaty bringing about an end to the Second Anglo-Maratha War, and peace would return to India for the time being. However, while the overall campaign was successful, the British military command faced severe scrutiny for its exceptionally costly handling of their forces during events such as the Battle of Assaye and the siege of Bharatpur, with Lord Wellesley being singled out for blame and thus forced to resign from the office of Governor-General in July 1805, being replaced by Lord Charles Cornwallis. Once again, though, peace between the British and the Marathas would not remain permanent, as with the British East India Company continuing to expand its influence across the country, it was clear that the Marathas were completely at the mercy of the colonial government, leading to resentment among the imperial leadership. Matters came to a head during 1817, when, as part of an arrangement between the British and the Gaikwad dynasty of Baroda, the Peshwa of Maratha could not collect revenue from the Baroda province, while during a mission to Pune to attempt to negotiate a dispute regarding revenue collection, the envoy, Gangadhar Shastri, as protected by the British, was murdered under what was suspected to be the orders of Maratha minister Trimbak Dango. In the wake of this event, the British took the opportunity to pressure Baji Rao II into the Treaty of Pune during June of the same year, terms of which included the admission of Dango's guilt, renouncing claims on Gaikwad, and the surrender of significant swathes of territory to the British, among these being the important stronghold of Deccan, the seaboard of Konkan, and all places north of the Narmada and south of the Tungbhadra rivers. Furthermore, the Peshwa was not to communicate with any other powers in India, and his cavalry was to be disbanded, the latter of which he complied with, but secretly kept them on standby, while in preparation for another bout of hostilities with the British, Baji Rao began to quietly fortify his positions at Sinhakad, Raigad, and Purandar throughout August 1817. Much like how the British had bribed away the senior military command of the Marathas during the previous war, Baji Rao attempted to do the same, hoping to buy the loyalty of Marathas currently in service with the British East India Company, though these were ultimately not successful, and most of his potentially vital allies, including the sepoys, remained steadfast with the colonists, reporting to the British authorities of the attempted bribery. On October 19, 1817, Baji Rao II tried to intimidate the British and their allies during the Dasara festival celebrations in Pune through a pretend charge by the Maratha cavalry against the British sepoys, while at the same time he plotted to have British envoy, Mount Stuart Elphinstone, assassinated, though Elphinstone was fully aware of these developments thanks to his widespread spy network. Regardless, the Maratha threat was not one to be taken lightly, as the Peshwa had, under both his command and the command of his chiefs and allies, 81,000 infantry, 106,000 cavalry, and 589 artillery pieces. The British East India Company, though, were more in the view of conquest rather than punitive action against the Marathas, seeing the murder of envoy Gangadhar Shastri as a perfect excuse to finally wipe out the ailing empire and mop up the last of their enclaves following the Second Anglo-Maratha War in 1805, mobilizing the largest ever army assembled in British India with 120,000 men. The gathering of so many British troops soured the confidence of many Peshwa allies, and in the face of such overwhelming odds, individual chiefs and tribal leaders sought their own diplomatic arrangements with the colonial government and disbanded their armies. Regardless, the Peshwa, Baji Rao II, opened the Third Anglo-Maratha War with the Battle of Kagdi on November 5, 1817, during which 20,000 Maratha cavalry and 8,000 infantry assaulted a severely outnumbered force of 3,000 British, though while the Marathas were initially able to break the British line, suppressive fire by the colonial infantry put the enemy into retreat, with only 86 British lost against 500 Marathas. Pune ultimately surrendered to the British in the wake of the battle, but the Peshwa was not yet defeated, retreating first to the city of Satara and then to the town of Koregaon, leading to a vicious and protracted battle between the Maratha guards and the pursuing colonial troops on January 1, 1818. With a force of 500 infantry, 200 cavalry, and 2 6-pounder guns, the British entered Koregaon and fought street to street in bloody urban warfare, the day-long confrontation seeing the loss of 175 British infantry and a third of the cavalry against 600 Marathas, with the Peshwa's troops eventually being put to flight. With the Peshwa unseated, a long pursuit of the imperial ruler took place throughout January and into February, Baji Rao attempting to seek the sanctuary and possible assistance of other chiefs and political leaders of the region, but was unsuccessful in currying their support, well aware that they had not the military strength to fight off the British in open combat, and would ultimately lose their possessions in the process. What followed was a period of generally no major engagements between the British and the Marathas, punctuated occasionally by fleeting skirmishes as the colonial troops caught up with the Peshwa at various locations. On February 19th, the British ambushed the Peshwa at Ashti, leading to the death of his military commander, General Bapu Gokhale, and the capture of the Raja of Satara with his brother and mother, this defeat being a crippling blow to the Peshwa's ability to continue his war with the British. By early April 1818, the forts of Singahad and Purandar had fallen to the colonists, and with nowhere left to hide, the Peshwa, Baji Rao, surrendered on June 3rd, bringing an end to the Third Anglo-Maratha War, but also the Maratha Empire in its entirety, with the lands occupied by colonial forces now being subjugated as part of the wider British India. For the Peshwa, in exchange for surrendering the Maratha Empire, the Jagirdars, his family, the Brahmins, and the religious institutions of his state, he would receive a life of opulence at his residence in Bithur near Kanpur, that was generously maintained by the British government at £80,000 per annum, where he would spend the rest of his days engaged in religious performances, excessive drinking, and multiple marriages. This wasn't completely the end of the conflict, though, as even with the capture and banishment of the Peshwa, multiple factions of what were formerly the Maratha Empire continued to fight against the British conquest, among them being the Pindaris, a warlike tribe of cavalry raiders who had long devastated the regions surrounding their domain in central India. During late 1817, the British had first made contact with the Pindaris, with General Hislop of the Madras Residency leading a campaign against the horsemen that drove them beyond the Narmada River, the Pindaris, armed only with spears, being no match against the ranged firearms of the colonial troops. From an initial force of 33,000 warriors, the Pindaris were gradually whittled down and scattered through defeat after defeat, with nearly all of the tribal leadership eventually being captured by the British forces, while high-ranking leader Wazil Mohammed committed suicide with poison, and tribal chief Chitu was pursued into the jungles before being killed by a tiger. Meanwhile, Mudhoji Bonsal, also known as Appa Saheb, consolidated his power at Nagpur after murdering the previous ruler and his own cousin, the mentally handicapped Parsoji Bonsal, Appa Saheb openly supporting the Peshwa and thus drew the ire of the British government, who feared his own army of brave but ill-disciplined Arab warriors could enter the wider conflict. In late 1817, troops of the British East India Company confronted Appa Saheb at the Sitabuldi fort near Nagpur, leading to a protracted battle that lasted through to the end of the year, the British being unsuccessful in breaching the walls of the fort and lost over 300 men during their attempts to seize the keep, leading eventually to the defenders being paid off with 50,000 rupees to abandon Nagpur. Ultimately, Appa Saheb signed a treaty with the British on January 9, 1818, that allowed him to rule over nominal territories with severe restrictions, among those being that most of his territory, including the forts, were now the property of the British Empire. Within days, though, Saheb was placed under arrest by the British, but escaped while en route to Allahabad, seeking refuge in the Punjab, but was dismissed by the Sikh authorities, being ultimately captured again by the British near Jodhpur, and thus kept under house arrest until his death in July 1849. The court of Holkar, based in Indore, was another province of the Maratha Empire that needed to be secured by force, as during this period the dynasty was ruled by the 11-year-old Maldar Rao Holkar III, under the regency of his dead father's mistress, Tulsi Bai Holkar, though she too would be murdered by her own troops in December 1817 due to her proposed alliance with the British. Thus, British troops advanced into Holkar territory in order to ensure any rebellion could be rooted out, leading to the Battle of Mahidpur on December 21, 1817, with Lieutenant General Thomas Hislop leading an extremely bloody action that saw 800 British troops killed against 300 Holkar warriors, bringing an end to the dynasty and destroying a major ally of the wider Maratha Empire. By mid-1818, all of the Maratha leaders had surrendered to the British, and various treaties had been ratified that surrendered its many provinces to colonial control, the final pockets of resistance throughout 1818 and into 1819 being individual Maratha forts that continued to fight against British occupation. The final fort to be taken was the Azirgarh fort, which continued the struggle until March 1819, when a British siege with artillery led to its ultimate capture on April 9th, and with its fall, the Anglo-Maratha Wars officially came to an end and military operations ceased. The outcomes of the Anglo-Maratha Wars were essentially the complete control of India south of the Sutlej River by the British Empire, with the Peshwa's former territories being absorbed into the Bombay Presidency, and the princes of Rajputana being reduced to feudal lords who accepted the British as the paramount power. The Maratha Confederacy thus became a ceremonial puppet of the British East India Company and the government in Bombay, with the 11-year-old Raghuji Bonsor III being appointed as the ruler of Nagpur under British guardianship, though the adopted son of the Peshwa, Nana Sahib, would lead an unsuccessful rebellion against the colonists in 1857. Sahib's attempted overthrow of the British government, after 1 year of conflict, would have the effect of galvanizing UK control in India, with the Mughal Empire being formally ended and British India being transferred to the rule of a crown colony rather than through the representation of the British East India Company, creating what would become known as the British Raj, and thus assuring direct government control of what was often referred to as the crown jewel of the British Empire.